Let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from Portland, Oregon is Liang. She is the Associate Professor of Economics at Willamette University. And with us in Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a Senior Fellow with the Pangoal Institution. Here in the studio is Jeff Moon. He's an International Trade and Government Affairs Consultant and a former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China. And a friend of the show, Merrill Matthews, is a resident scholar with the Institute for Policy and Innovation in Dallas. Jeff, I have to start with you because, you've been inside the U.S. Trade Representative. What is going on? We're waiting for potentially tariffs coming down on this $200 billion. There's been a big consultation period. A lot of American companies saying, don't do this. And then, while we're still waiting for that, the U.S. president says, oh, but I've got another $267 billion worth of Chinese goods to tariff soon after that. I mean, this seems like a sort of escalation.
Well, American law requires the consultation period, notice and comment. That's what's just concluded yesterday. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 gives the president full discretion to impose tariffs in any amount and with any percentage.
So it doesn't have to go through a consultation period?
It does not. No,
Wow.
He has the discretion in order to do that. In terms of the additional $267 billion, that would take several months to come into effect because there would have to be another consultation, notice and comment period before he would be able to do that. So when he says it's ready in the short term, we're talking months, not immediately. But by all accounts, the administration is prepared to move ahead soon with the $200 billion that we've been talking about for the last few months.
So $200 billion, we've got $50 billion already tariffed,
correct,
plus 276. That would be everything, right? All Chinese imports into the U.S.
Yes, that's right.
Incredible. Liang, what's Beijing's position here? Because obviously every time we've seen tariffs imposed, there's been a retaliation. But is China going to run out of tariffs to retaliate with soon? And what's the strategy?
Well, before this the announcement of the $200 billion imposition, Beijing already pledged $60 billion of the U.S. exports to China will be under tariff, ranging 4 bands from 10% to 25%. But you're right. Once Washington imposed another tariff on the 267 billion Chinese exports to the U.S., then China will run out of goods to tariff. That said, I think there are other things that Beijing can do to counteract this trade war. Things like making some more administrative red tapes for the U.S. companies operating in China and so on. One thing that I think it's important to note is that Beijing increasingly seem to reckon that this is not just about trade disputes, and they were more, I would say, they were more willing to make concessions on trade front, such as reduce the trade imbalances, lower tariffs, or provide more market access to U.S. businesses. But the People's Daily, which is the mouthpiece of the Communist Party, issued a statement in last month and basically said this trade war seemed to be a testament to, quote, Washington's engagement plus containment approach to China. And so what that means is that there are a lot of the demands from Washington, D.C. simply are not open to negotiation.
I'm glad you brought up that People's Daily article because I've read that too, and a lot of people have. Qinduo Xu, in that article, as Liang said, containment was the fear in China that is behind the U.S. policy, thwarting China's rise, and called for a phrase that we almost hear with the DPRK, strategic patience when it comes to the U.S. Is Beijing waiting out Donald Trump, hoping that maybe Congress changes hands in the midterm elections or an investigation gets him or something?
Well, not exactly. And remember, first of all, the linkage between the trade issue between China and the United States and the issue of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, obviously, it was first done by President Trump, not by the Chinese side. And the Chinese side has never officially, at least officially, linked the two issues somehow. And secondly, for China, yes, there's a concern, whether the U.S. is changing its China policy in the overall manner, not only about trade, but also about say, strategy, China's strategy or geopolitics in that respect. But so far, China has tried to contain the disputes within the trade area, to avoid spillover to other issues like currency, other aspects of the disputes between the two countries. So I think China is quite firm in its response to the U.S. Tariffs or upcoming tariffs. At the same time, because for China, some of the requirements, some of the demands by the Trump administration is simply impossible for China to meet. Some of them, that's fine. Some of them, that's negotiable. But not, for example, like the basically abandoning Made in China 2025 industrial policy. That's very hard for China to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you said this because obviously people hope that there's an end game in sight here for Washington about what they really want. Merrill Matthews in Dallas, do you see what an end game here for the Trump administration would look like, short of, as Qinduo Xu just said, China essentially changing or abandoning its industrial policy?
Well, look, I think the containment is an issue, but I think that was addressed in the defense bill that passed last month. I think the bigger issue for President Trump right now is the tech transfer and what he believes is the IP theft going on in China, and they want to try to address that. So they're putting more pressure on the government to try to bring in both the tariffs issue, but also to address the tech transfer. And I know the Chinese government typically denies that this is really going on or the Chinese government has any real role in this, but it's widely believed in the U.S. That the Chinese government is just simply not putting enough pressure on tech transfer, IP theft, and subsidies that it should be doing.
Thank you. Yeah, as China is actually saying the opposite than that. In fact, they've been putting out more and more statements and examples. Li Keqiang, of course, who has been responsible for the economy, was with ExxonMobil, for example, unveiling a big investment in Guangdong province. I want to play a little bit of what he had to say and then get Jeff's reaction off the back.
中方将视美方的行动
China will take necessary countermeasures responding to the actions of the U.S. At the same time, China will pay close attention to the influence brought by the tariffs and take strong measures to help Chinese and overseas companies in China overcome difficulties. China has the confidence, capability, and means to safeguard the steady and healthy development of the Chinese economy.
That was actually Gao Feng from the Ministry of Commerce, but I want to read this from Premier Li Keqiang. China will stick to reform and opening up, further ease market access, equally treat Chinese and foreign companies, better protect intellectual property, constantly improve its business environment and remain an attractive investment destination for foreign companies. This is a big PR push to say open for business. We have the Shanghai import fair coming up in October, I think. This is a big sign to not just the US but the rest of the world saying, look, we are opening up, we are reforming. What's happening here?
Well, with all due respect to the Premier, all of those things have been said before for decades. And so to the extent that China is committed to opening up and treating foreign companies and domestic companies the same, that's very welcome. But the fact of the matter is that China has an opaque web of regulations that it uses behind closed doors to discriminate against foreign companies, to force technology transfer, and to cause IP problems. These are the problems that need to be addressed. I agree with the previous speaker that repealing China 2025 is not realistic. Yeah, but there are concrete steps that can be taken to address those long-standing problems. You know, the U.S.-China Business Council did a survey of American firms, and a third of them said that they have been subject to forced technology transfer requests. So there is a problem here. I can personally testify I have seen that problem, and I hope that the two parties, the U.S. and China, can actually work together to address these things. We really do need to address them.
Yang, your reaction to that in terms of where China needs to move potentially and where the US needs to move to get some sort of compromise here, because the escalation, it literally looks like it's around the corner.
Right. I think the previous speakers have addressed some important issues that, yes, China and the US need to work on. But in terms of IP protection and so on, I don't think we should be oblivious of the Chinese progress on this. Remember that Chinese has made a lot more payments to the use of foreign technologies in the recent years. The last year, the number was, $29 billion of the usage for foreign technology. So yes, admittedly, China needs to work on, protecting IP. But again, I don't think having this trade war, this tariff escalation is the right way to go. And I think eventually this is not going to make Beijing to make concessions, but rather, escalate the trade war, and it's going to negatively impact both countries.
Qinduo Xu, in terms of China's policy, made in China 2025, but also opening up, there's a big stress on sort of multilateralism, not necessarily the sort of G2 that we've seen before between US and China. And I want to just play you this clip from Xi Jinping recently at the China-Africa Summit, and then ask you a follow-up question off the back.
霸权主义、强权政治
Hegemony and power politics persist. Protectionism and unilateralism are mounting. War, conflicts, terrorism, famine, and epidemics continue to plague us. Security challenges, both traditional and non-traditional, remain as complex and interwoven as ever. However, we affirm that peace and development remain the underlying trend of our times. Indeed, this is the call of the times, and the international community should take the historical responsibilities and respond with solidarity, vision, courage, and a sense of mission.
That's President Xi Jinping there talking to the Africa Summit. Lots of talk about Belt and Road, as you know. Much less focus on the United States at the moment. Are we seeing a potential decoupling of that relationship that has driven, Qinduo Xu, the world economy for so long?
Well, for China, the development is still the priority for the country. And I think, there's basically unanimous understanding that is like peace and stability is critical to the development and, economic growth, not only for China, but also for developing countries, for example, African countries. But African countries, some of them at least, are suffering from, say, conflicts, suffering from disease, suffering from other problems. So China stresses very much about maintaining peace and stability. Of course, China is also critical of some of the U.S. military adventures previously. Let's say Iraq War, a war in Afghanistan, which is still to end. But also, let me respond a little bit about the transfer of technology or forced transfer of technology. There might be separate cases, isolated cases, at a regional level to a certain provincial or county level governments. But if you look at the policy, national policy, there's no such policy, no such rule that will ask foreign companies to hand over their technology to the Chinese side. And secondly, people have to put that into perspective. When it comes to per capita income, China is still, ranks the 70s. It's a developing country. And if you look at the development, the history, the transfer of technology from more developed countries to developing countries, that's a natural part of development. China is doing that too, transferring technology to some of the African countries. But of course, you should not do it in a forced manner.
Okay. I want Jeff Moon to pick up on that, because that is an argument that we've heard a lot of from Beijing, and one that isn't recognized in Washington, about China still being a developing country. The WTO has certain different rules. Technology transfer is actually encouraged sometimes in developing countries' trade practices early on. How do we get around this? Because China is obviously very developed in some ways, but still developing in others.
Well, 15 years ago when China entered the WTO, it certainly was a developing country. Now it is the #2 economy in the world. It runs large trade deficits with almost all of its trading partners. It is definitely a developed economy, and it should be treated as such. And that comes with some obligations. And that's the nub of the problem here, that the deal that China cut 15 years ago was very favorable as a developing country. Many sectors were closed off at that point. But 15 years later, China's grown up. It's a part of the adult community. It can now take on responsibilities.
So could you see a deal here where there's some sort of reform of the WTO, China gets the market status it wanted, but then some more rules as well?
Well, that gets a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
There's a bilateral dispute and then the multilateral dispute.
Yeah.
There is a separate set of discussions about reforming the WTO.
But
and
the US
that's
is
moving
key
along.
to this because it's currently...
The U.S. would be key to that. And so that would deal with some of the market economy status. But I think that what the U.S. is really asking for is reforms that take on the responsibilities of a developed,
From China
mature
first.
economy running a large deficit, the second largest economy in the world.
Thanks so much. Merrill, I want to put this to you. What is the Trump strategy here? I was at the hearings, for example, on this latest potential round of tariffs on $200 billion worth of inputs, and I was blown away by the number of US businesses saying, don't do this. There were a few that said do it, but largely a lot. I mean, this is a big economic gamble. We know that the US economy is booming right now, but this could hit a lot of businesses in the areas that voted for Donald Trump and will have to vote in the midterms.
And it's already hitting them, Nathan. But you're absolutely right. This is a huge gamble. Donald Trump says he wants China to lower its tariffs. So if I were talking to President Xi, I'd say call his bluff. Come back. President Trump has said to the G7, I want to go to zero tariffs and trade barriers. He said he has a deal with Jean-Claude Juncker of the European Union. He wants to go, they want to negotiate to get down to zero tariffs and trade barriers. I suggest President Xi come up and say, let's give us the same deal. It'll take some years to do it, but let's agree to try to get to that point and start that negotiations. I think if you were to do that, you would either call his bluff or you'd get us on the right path.
Well, I'm glad you brought up other trade deals, or the lack of them, but trade discussions. The European Union seemed to have rejected a lot of what Trump's asked for its comeback. And of course, here in North America, we're waiting for this sort of revised North American free trade agreement. Mexico may be on board, as long as Canada's on board. Canada is not on board at the moment. I just want to play a clip from from Canada's Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who was here in Washington, D.C. negotiating this week.
You know, the thing about trade negotiations is nothing is done until everything is done. And so really what I can say is we are making good progress. We continue to get a deeper and deeper understanding of the concerns on both sides. The atmosphere continues to be constructive. There is a lot of goodwill on both sides. And for Canada, our focus is on getting a good deal, not just any deal.
We've heard that in many trade negotiations,
Right.
so it means we're not there yet.
Every trade negotiation.
Yeah, exactly. But she gave it a good try. How important is this for Donald Trump's trade strategy? Because he came into a lot of criticism for having all these different trade disputes, even with neighbors and allies, and won't be able to make Beijing move until something happens. Is that what's going on here?
Well, I think that this is going to settle out. He's already settled out with Mexico. I think they will come to a deal with Canada. I think they will come to a deal with Europe as well.
Even despite the threats of putting 25% tariff on essentially American cars going back and forth on the border?
I think that's all hyperbole, and that's all just trying to get leverage in the trade negotiation. And now that the negotiation is proceeding, I think that will go away eventually.
Okay. Yang, are we all Canada in this? Is Beijing Canada? Where basically you have to sort of ignore the hyperbole, as Jeff was saying, and just wait it out until there's a deal that both sides can work on?
Well, I think it's a pretty different negotiation with Canada as opposed to with Beijing. The scale is very different, and I think the disputes are very different in nature. I think responding to the previous speakers, I think a lot of these sort of trade disputes are pretty much the tactics of contain China, preventing China from being the technological leader and economic power. I also wanted to go back to the point of China being the developing nation. Yes, if you look at the total size, China is the second largest economy. But if you look at the per capita GDP on the PPP basis, China is barely a quarter of the U.S. level. And if you also look at the Chinese exports to the United States, 30% of the value are pretty much originated from other countries.
Yes, the iPhone
and finally,
example, yeah. Carry on.
Right, and finally, as China, indicated in its white paper on the WTO accession, it already, made all those different changes, policy changes, and ratification of different rules, and trying to subscribe to, the rules imposed by the WTO. And in fact, just last month, China filed a complaint to the WTO about the U.S.'s tariff. So I wanted to just, add, this is not sort of violation of China against international trade rules, but rather Trump's accusation.
Thank you. Qinduo, what happens if Canada and Mexico and the U.S. can agree? Does that mean bad news for Beijing, considering the North American trade bloc will be united again and Washington will have more leverage over Beijing, or do you not see it that way?
Well, psychologically or symbolically,
go ahead.
That would mean the U.S. would have time to deal with China, after concluding trade deals with Mexico and Canada, even with the European Union. But that would be very difficult and time-consuming. But then, in essence, it doesn't change much because it's really a big issue between China and the United States. And ultimately, they need to sit down and talk to each other because, by imposing tariffs, problem will not be gone. There's the U.S. concern, there's the Chinese concerns, and I think they should reach a compromise as much as possible. But so far, if you look at the Chinese side, China is obviously continuing with this reform and opening up. I understand that there's some people, like in the United States, people are not that patient to say, oh, China should have done this probably a year ago. I tend to agree. Yeah, China probably should quicken the pace of reform and opening up. But some of the latest reforming measures are very substantial in terms of market access, in terms of the ownership of foreign firms in investment in China. Issues like that. So we are optimistic. I think long-term issues will be resolved.
Okay, Merrill, I suppose duration is a big point here, how long this trade war goes on and not just how deep. Soybean farmers can hold on for a little bit, but if China starts replacing soybeans with different crops from Ukraine or Central Asia, then it becomes a problem. Where is the tipping point here in terms of duration? A few months, a year, two?
It's a very good question because I would expect that a number of U.S. companies are already beginning to look at other suppliers that could provide them things that are not being hit with the tariffs. So there is a real threat. It won't necessarily be the most efficient approach. They're trying to find the most efficient approach by going to China. So it's a real threat to both economies, but markets tend to find a way around regulations as best they can. So if we don't get this deal addressed fairly quickly, we will see, I think, some long-term ramifications from it that won't be good for either economy.
So if China looks elsewhere, U.S. companies, Jeff, must be doing the same thing, looking at supply chains. China's wages have gone up. Are they looking at India again? Are they looking at Vietnam? And Chinese companies are moving to these places too. So, what happens? Sorry, Mel. I'm just going to
companies are already looking at other places.
Sorry, Mel. I'm going to let Jeff Moon have the last word here because he used to be inside the USTR and he can tell us. So, what do you think about this whole disruption?
Companies for a long time have had contingency supply chain plans, but those were all theoretical. Now, as this seems to be going for a longer term, they're going to start implementing them. And this is something, these may be changes that won't be reversed. And that would be a real shame because once you invest in those kinds of changes, it's difficult to push them back. So this is one of the longer term effects. The longer this goes on, the more that becomes an issue and our current trading relationship gets adjusted.
Quite incredible to think about that, really, considering how interlocked those two economies have been.
They are.
For increasingly for the last 4 decades, really. Jeff, thanks so much for coming in here in the studio. I want to thank our guests from all the way out on the West Coast, in Beijing, in Texas as well. Thanks so much for joining us. That's all we have time for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching. See you soon.